Watching and waiting as a 40-mile convoy of Russian tanks and artillery heads towards Kyiv is horrible. It's horrible to watch from the UK. It's a million times worse to watch from Kyiv. And it's a context in which Ukrainians are increasingly calling on the West to intervene in a more proactive way. Daria Kaleniuk is a Ukrainian journalist. She made this emotional plea to Boris Johnson.
Ukrainian women and Ukrainian children are in deep fear because of bombs and missiles which are going from the sky. And Ukrainian people are desperately asking for the West to protect our sky. We are asking for the no-fly zone. We are saying in response that it will trigger World War III. But what is the alternative, Mr. Prime Minister? To observe how our children are, instead of planes, are protecting NATO from the missiles and bombs? What's the alternative for the no-fly zone? We have planes here, we have air defense system in Poland, in Romania. NATO has this air defense. At least this air defense could shield the Western Ukraine so that these children with women could come to the border. It's impossible now to cross the border. There are 30 kilometers of lines. Imagine crossing the border with a baby.
Now, I have every sympathy for any Ukrainian asking the West to do whatever they possibly can to stop Russian troops bombing their cities. And I have every sympathy for the Ukrainian journalists asking that question. Ukrainians right now are faced with a hideous set of scenarios. But it remains the case that a no-fly zone would be a terrible idea. No-fly zones don't happen by magic or by agreement. They are enforced by shooting planes out of the sky. And if the West were to shoot Russian planes out of the sky, we'd be risking nuclear war. As I say, even though it's a terrible idea, I have every sympathy for Ukrainians asking for it. I have less sympathy, though, for the liberal pundits in the West echoing that call. Anti-Brexit campaigner Femi Olawale shared Kaleniuk's question with this caption. "It's insane that I'm starting a tweet with, 'I don't want World War III, but'." Then he goes on, "The idea that we would shoot down Russian planes that were bombing NATO civilians but not Ukrainian ones, as if treaties make Ukrainians' lives less worthy of protecting." He's saying, and then there's this sort of sad face, this is a bad idea, he's suggesting. If you start a tweet with, "It's insane that I'm starting a tweet with, 'I don't want to start World War III, then probably you're off on the wrong track. We really should be trying to avoid World War III. And any kind of moralistic argument, we say Ukrainian lives matter as much as Latvian lives because they're already in NATO. Obviously, all of these lives matter the same. But protecting Latvia, which is in NATO, is a very different situation to protecting people in Ukraine, if that means shooting down Russian troops. And whatever however bad it gets in Ukraine, nuclear war is worse. You have to live in the real world. We can go to some more of comments like this. Mail on Sunday columnist Dan Hodges posted this. "If people want to oppose a no-fly zone, fine, but understand that is an act of appeasement, no different to our appeasement of Hitler in 1938. We are refusing to do what we know is morally right out of fear, and we are prepared to let a free nation die to safeguard ourselves." Now, he's making this sound so selfish, right? Opposing nuclear war isn't just to safeguard ourselves. We are talking about a war which could kill millions and millions and millions and millions of people. It is not selfish to want to avoid a nuclear catastrophe. And it's not shameful to act out of fear when the fear you are acting out of is a fear that a nuclear apocalypse could happen. Now, you might say, look, neither of these people I've shown you are foreign policy experts. NBC's chief foreign policy correspondent had a similar idea, though. On Monday, he said, "Perhaps the biggest risk calculation moral dilemma of the war so far. A massive Russian convoy is about 30 miles from Kyiv. The US, NATO could likely destroy it, but that would be direct involvement against Russia and risk everything. Does the West watch in silence as it rolls?" Now, as I say, I've shown you some people who weren't foreign policy experts, Femi and Dan Hodges. This guy is the chief foreign correspondent for NBC, one of America's biggest networks. And he seems to be openly advocating a course of action that would risk nuclear war. Luckily, most people in and around government aren't being quite as gung-ho. Tommy Vita is a former spokesperson for the US National Security Council. He replied to Richard Engel saying, "The way you tweet about whether the US and NATO should engage in a full-on war against a nuclear-armed superpower is shockingly glib. It's not as simple as watch in silence as it rolls or not. The stakes are risking nuclear annihilation." So a word of sanity there. Also, to his credit, Boris Johnson has ruled out a no-fly zone. We can go back to part of that question from the Ukrainian journalist, now with Boris Johnson's answer.
NATO is not willing to defend because NATO is afraid of a World War III, but it is already started. And these are Ukrainian children who are there taking the hit.
Unfortunately, the implication of that is that the UK and would be engaged in shooting down Russian planes, would be engaged in direct combat with Russia. That's not something that we can do.
I mean, it's been just so painful to watch the UK's commentariat turned sort of armchair generals speaking so glibly about this when we, as you've outlined, the stakes are so high. It is, of course, absolutely true that Ukraine now faces an abominable situation where it feels inconceivable that there are any pathways out of this that aren't going to cost an immense number of lives. But these same journalists that are now banging the war drum have not actually paused to reflect on, why did we get here? How did we get here? And that is actually where the answer of what should be done lies. Because as it stands now, it's really difficult to imagine what a peaceful way out of this situation could look like, because the choice to not get into this situation needed to have been made much earlier in the process. And so the answer is found in that long view historical way of looking at things, rather than, this kind of clash of civilizations narrative that a lot of these journalists are engaging in, which is, West is good, East is bad. But actually, as I've sort of outlined before, that dividing of the world into imperialist blocs, that competing for economic hegemony, that flooding the world with weapons, that arming the world with nuclear weapons, you end up having those countries that fall at particular strategic nodes becoming disposable and being put in these impossible situations. That context creates a ticking time bomb. And it's incredibly convenient as kind of one of these mainstream media journalists, if you have essentially co-signed the creation of that world, the creation of that context, because let's not forget, many of the commentators that are now banging the war drum are the same ones that have actively chased anyone out of public life who has suggested, that we should work towards a disarmed world, or one that suggests that we shouldn't interfere in the democratic processes of other nations, that we shouldn't, wantonly flout international law, that we shouldn't, go above the multilateral diplomatic institutions, which for all of their limitations, and there are many, it's better than having a world that is organized by, authoritarian strongmen, essentially, who are armed with a bunch of nukes. And also, who have chased out anyone from public life, who have taken a solid stance against the global arms industry, which is pretty values neutral in who it's willing to arm. And yet those same figures that have been complicit in the creation of that world are now very ready to strip the current catastrophe in Ukraine completely out of that historical context and basically create this dynamic where you're either pro Putin, or you're pretty chill about the notion of World War III, which is obviously an impossible and absurd situation. And I worry that as people naturally respond with fear and uncertainty at this, unacceptable act of aggression from Putin against Ukraine, that that logical response is being used as a way to condone or legitimize that kind of world setup, to act like, it was inevitable that the only way to fight one imperialist bloc is to arm up and strengthen our imperialist bloc. And that has allowed for authoritarian strongmen like Putin to rise to the top. And, that the consequences of that are not being felt by armchair generals, writing from the columns of the Times. They're being felt by the Ukrainian people. And so the only way that you undermine imperialism of one form is by undermining all imperialisms. And so I think that this kind of banging of the war drum in this way, I worry that it is going to give credence to the idea that the way we have established the world, which is that we need to have more arms, more nukes, more strongmen, more authoritarians than the other side, that is somehow going to be legitimized as inevitable, when in fact it is entirely constructed and is what has led us into this mess in the first place.